The box was heavier than you expected. That was the first thing. You had carried model kits before, small boxes with a modest collection of balsa sheets and a folded instruction sheet, and you thought you knew the weight of a model aircraft kit, but the Top Flite Gold Edition P-51D Mustang, or the P-47 Thunderbolt, or the F-4U Corsair with its distinctive inverted gull wing that you'd spent 3 months saving for, had a weight to it that communicated something immediately and unmistakably. This was not like the kits you had built before. This was something else. You set it on the workbench and cut the tape and opened the lid. And the first thing that reached you was the smell of fresh balsa. That specific dry sweetness that belongs to no other material in the world. That is the smell of potential before it has been realized. The smell of all the evenings and weekends that were being made available to you in the form of die-cut sheets and spruce strips and hardware bags sealed in plastic. The smell was there. And then beneath it, the sharper note of the instruction manual's ink. And beneath that, the very faint petroleum smell of the clear plastic parts, the vacuum-formed canopy, the molded cowl details that represented the scale accuracy the Gold Edition name promised. Then the plans, you unrolled them carefully because they were large enough to require both hands and because you understood already that these documents were the governing authority of the next several months of your life. Full size, printed on heavy paper and ink, that showed every rib, every spar, every former in its relationship to every other piece of the structure. The tail surfaces occupied one sheet. The wing occupied another. The fuselage was a third, or sometimes a fourth, depending on the model's complexity, and you had to pin them all to the building board and orient yourself relative to them before anything else happened. The plans were intimidating not because they were obscure, but because they were comprehensive. They showed you exactly what you were undertaking, and the precision of what they showed you made the undertaking feel real in a way that a photograph on a box never could. The parts were organized in die-cut sheets, laser-cut in the later years, die-cut before that, each part labeled with a letter and a number that corresponded to a reference in the instruction manual. There were more parts than you had anticipated. This is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Top Flite Gold Edition experience. The moment you laid out the sheets and counted the number of distinct pieces and understood, for the first time, the scale of what you were taking on. This was going to take months. You knew it when you looked at those sheets, and the knowing did not dissuade you. If anything, it was a form of promise that the thing you were going to build was substantial enough to deserve months, that the aircraft in the photographs on the box was not available for less. If the memory of that moment is still with you, the smell of the balsa and the weight of the unrolled plans and the quiet realization of what you were about to undertake, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, not for the algorithm. So stories like this one don't fade from the record of what the RC hobby was and what it meant to the people who practiced it seriously. The craft that Top Flite represented deserves to be remembered, and keeping these histories visible is part of how they stay alive. Top Flite Models Inc. was a Chicago company whose origins trace to the early decades of American radio control aviation. Before it became possible to assume that radio-controlled flight was a realistic ambition for an ordinary person with ordinary resources. The company had been producing kits through the model aviation boom of the post-war era, and it had navigated the hobby's evolution through the 1960s and 1970s. As radio control technology improved to the point where scale accuracy and flying performance were not mutually exclusive. By the time the Gold Edition designation was established, the company had a clear sense of what it was doing and for whom. Top Flite's most important product was arguably not a kit, but a covering material. MonoKote, the iron-on-plastic covering film that Top Flite developed and sold under their brand, became the industry standard for finishing model aircraft, the material against which other covering films were compared. The product whose name became a generic in the way that very few brand names become generics. A builder who covered their model in MonoKote had access to a surface finish that was glossy, durable, and available in every color and metallic the scheme required, including the precise scale colors needed to replicate the markings of specific historical aircraft. The company that made the covering also made the kits that the covering was intended for, and this integration was not incidental. The Gold Edition kits were designed with MonoKote coverage in mind, with surface areas and panel lines arranged so that the covering material could follow the structure without stretching or wrinkling, producing a finish whose quality in the hands of a careful builder could approach the appearance of painted fiberglass. The Gold Edition name meant something specific. It was Top Flite's designation for their scale warbird series, the kits that pushed the boundary of what a traditional balsa and plywood construction could achieve in terms of scale accuracy and aerodynamic fidelity. The P51D Mustang at 65 inches of wingspan was approximately 1/7 scale, designed by David Ribby, and its Gold Edition status meant that the wing's airfoil had been computer designed to progressively change from root to tip with built-in washout, a design feature that improved flying characteristics at the cost of substantial engineering effort. The Gold Edition P51D prototype, covered in MonoKote by the Top Flite development team, finished second in expert at the 1992 Bluegrass Scale Classic in Kentucky. It posted the highest flight scores in the expert category. This was not a participation result. This was a kit-built model competing against specialist scale aircraft built by experienced competition builders and performing at that level. The giant scale versions represented the further ambition. An 84-inch wingspan P51D at 1/5 scale. A giant P47 Thunderbolt whose radiator scoop and gun ports were not merely suggested by molded plastic, but were precisely formed details integrated into the kit structure. These were aircraft that demanded a serious engine, a 1 cubic inch 4-stroke, or a gasoline engine in the 20 to 30 cubic centimeter range, and a serious radio system with 5 standard servos and specialized retracts for the landing gear. They were aircraft that at flying fields equipped to handle large aircraft commanded the attention of everyone present from the moment you began the engine start procedure to the moment the wheels touched down. This was the aspirational dimension of the Top Flite identity. These kits were not sold as projects for people who wanted a flying aircraft. They were sold as projects for people who wanted to build a flying aircraft, who understood the distinction, who valued the building as much as the flying, and who were willing to invest the months required to do the building correctly. The Gold Edition designation was a quality signal, but it was also a challenge. This kit is for someone serious enough to meet it. The building ritual of a Top Flite Gold Edition warbird had a sequence and a pace that no other form of hobby engagement replicated. It began with reading, which was not incidental to the process. The instruction manual for a Gold Edition P47 or P51 ran to 50 or 60 pages of photographed, step-by-step process documentation, with each photograph showing a real model in the actual state of construction being described. You read the manual before you cut the first part from the sheet. You read it again after you had oriented yourself to the plans. You return to it during construction to understand why a step was being done in a particular way. And you found often that the reason was embedded in a step that came 10 pages later. that the sequence of operations had been designed by someone who had built the prototype and had discovered the sequence that avoided the problems that a different sequence would have introduced. The tail surfaces came first. This was standard in Top Flite's instruction sequence, and the logic was clear. The tail surfaces were the smallest and least structurally complex assemblies in the aircraft, which made them the right starting point for a builder who was still establishing their rhythm with the material and the technique. You built the horizontal stabilizer over the plan, each rib cut from the die-cut sheet with a sharp blade to remove the last few fibers of the die cut. Each one placed in its position on the spar and held in place with a T-pin, while the CA adhesive wicked into the joint by capillary action. Thin-E on balsa to plywood, the knowledge of which adhesive for which joint was not written as a universal rule in the manual. It was embedded in the specific instructions for each step, and assembling that knowledge into a general principle was itself a form of learning that happened over the course of the build. The wing was the center of the project. The wing of a scale warbird is the aircraft's most demanding structural assembly, more complex than the fuselage in its internal organization, more demanding in its dimensional tolerances, more consequential in its effect on flying characteristics if it was built with any warp or asymmetry. The Top Flite Gold Edition wing was built in 2 panels on the plan, each panel pinned flat to the building board over the wax paper and built rib by rib over the drawing. The main spar was a complex assembly of spruce cap strips sandwiching a plywood web, and the ribs were notched to accept it. And the spar and the ribs were glued. And then the leading edge and trailing edge were added, and then the sheeting, 1/16" balsa sheet glued to the top and bottom of the forward portion of the wing to create a torsion box that held the wing's shape against the aerodynamic loads of flight. Sheeting a wing was an afternoon's work minimum. The balsa sheet had to be cut to fit the wing's compound curve, soaked in water to make it pliable enough to conform to the shape, applied with contact cement or slow CA over the ribs and the spar and the leading edge sheeting, and then held in shape with weights and clothespins until the adhesive set. If you rushed this step, if you applied the sheet before it was pliable enough or removed the weights before the adhesive had fully cured, the result was a sheet with a bubble or a delamination that would have to be repaired before the covering went on, because MonoKote would faithfully transmit any surface imperfection beneath it to the finished appearance of the wing. The wing knew. The wing always knew. Fiberglass work distinguished the Gold Edition builds from the older construction traditions. The fuselage of a full-scale warbird like the P-51 or the P-47 was an aluminum semi-MonoKote structure with internal frames and longerons, and the structural logic of this original design was faithfully replicated in the Top Flite kit, with the frames and longerons reproduced in plywood and balsa. The outside of the fuselage was sheeted in balsa, and the sheeted balsa was then covered with fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin, a process that required mixing the 2-part epoxy with the precision that chemical processes require, wetting out the cloth on the balsa surface, smoothing out the bubbles and dry spots before the epoxy set, and then sanding the cured surface through a sequence of grits from 80 to 150 to 220 until the surface was smooth enough for MonoKote. This was not a fast process. It was measured in evenings, and each evening required cleaning the mixing cups and the brushes with acetone before the resin hardened in them. The smell of that acetone, and of the epoxy itself during mixing, and of the balsa dust that settled on every horizontal surface in the workshop during the weeks of sanding. These are the sensory record of what a Top Flite build required. The dust was the the but uh, Covering with MonoKote was a final examination before flight. The iron, a dedicated sealing iron, not a domestic clothes iron. Though domestic clothes irons had served in the years before the specialized tools appeared, moved across the surface of the covering film in smooth, even strokes at a temperature calibrated to shrink the film without distorting it. Too hot, and the film would pull away from the structure. Too cool, and it would fail to adhere properly, leaving bubbles that could be seen from 10 feet away and felt from the cockpit on a turbulent day. The temperature was on a dial, but the feedback was in the film's behavior, the way it lay down or resisted, the way the edges sealed to themselves or lifted, the way the surface tightened as it cooled. The scale markings that went over the MonoKote, the stencils, the national insignia, the aircraft serial numbers, the nose art if the specific aircraft being replicated had nose art, these required a different kind of attention. The geometric accuracy of a star and bar, the dimensional correctness of a Royal Air Force roundel, the precise placement of a yellow identification band on a P-47's cowl. Reference photographs taken from every angle of a surviving example of the specific aircraft type or of wartime photographs were pinned to the wall of the workshop alongside the model under construction. The scale of the markings had to match the scale of the aircraft. The placement had to match the placement in the photographs. This was research as well as craftsmanship, and the builder who had done it well knew that they had done it well when they stood at the field and looked at the finished aircraft from 20 feet away, and it looked like what it was supposed to look like. The Top Flite Gold Edition kit at its peak occupied a specific and important position in the world of RC aviation culture. It was not the cheapest way to own a flying warbird. It was not the fastest way. It was the way that built the greatest relationship between the builder and the aircraft, the way that produced at the end of the months of work, a machine whose every dimension and component you understood personally because you had put each one in place yourself. This relationship between builder and aircraft was not a feature that Top Flite advertised explicitly because it was not something that could be conveyed in catalog copy. It was something that the people who had completed a gold edition build understood, and it was the primary reason they were likely to begin another one. The flying fields of the 1980s and 1990s were, at their best, collections of these relationships made visible. An AMA field on a summer weekend morning in 1990 or 1995 might have a dozen or more aircraft in various stages of preparation at the flight line. And among them, the Top Flite warbirds were recognizable from a distance, not because they were the largest aircraft present, though the giant scale builds were among the largest, but because of what they looked like in the ear. A Top Flite Gold Edition P-51, correctly built and trimmed, had the silhouette of the original Mustang, because the kit's design had been organized around achieving that silhouette. When it climbed off the grass and raised its gear and turned onto its base leg and dropped flaps on approach, it looked like what it was supposed to look like. Not an approximation of a P-51, but a P-51 at 1/7 scale, doing what a P-51 did. The community that gathered around this experience was organized around a specific set of values that the Top Flite kit embodied: the primacy of the building process, the the pride of scale accuracy, the willingness to invest time in something because the investment was intrinsically worthwhile. The builders who carried top flight boxes to the workbench were, in a meaningful sense, a guild, a community of practitioners who shared a standard and recognized it in each other's work. At the AMA scale contests that provided the formal expression of this culture, the sportsman class for pilots competing for the first time, the expert class for those who had won before. The gold edition warbirds were regular competitors, and the scores they achieved reflected the quality of a design whose aerodynamic fidelity had been established by computer and whose structural integrity had been built in by whoever had followed the instructions with sufficient care. The scale contest was the formal expression of something that had an informal expression at every AMA field where serious builders flew. The judgment of the community was real, and it was ongoing. You brought an aircraft to the field, and the people there looked at it, not unkindly, not competitively in any unfriendly sense, but with the specific attention of people who understood what they were looking at and had opinions about it. They could see whether the covering was smooth, or whether it showed the ribs beneath it as a corrugated surface rather than a smooth one. They could see whether the color match was accurate, whether the panel lines ran in the right direction, whether the markings were positioned correctly on a specific aircraft type that people present might have seen in photographs or in museums or in person. They had this knowledge because they had built the same aircraft or aircraft of the same type, or because they had simply been around long enough to absorb what accuracy looked like. This attention was a form of respect, even when it included criticism. It said, your work is worth examining. It said the standard you are being held to is a real standard, not a social courtesy. The builder who received the experienced pilot's assessment of the finished aircraft, the observation that the vertical fin was slightly too far aft, or that the aileron gap was wider than it needed to be, or that the MonoKote had been applied on a warm day and would benefit from a heat gun touch-up now that the weather had cooled, received it as what it was, an investment in their improvement, offered by someone who understood the craft and cared about its continuation. The hobbyists who built these kits were not all the same kind of person. Some were veterans who had known the actual aircraft and who built the models as a form of continuing relationship with machines that had mattered in their lives. Some were engineers and machinists who brought professional precision to the workbench and whose finished models reflected tolerances that the kit had not required, but that their hands had imposed. Some were teenagers who had been brought into the hobby by a father or an uncle, and who were in building their first gold edition kit, learning something about patience and sequence, and the relationship between effort and outcome that no other experience in their lives had yet delivered. What they shared was the willingness to sit with the process, to return to the building board evening after evening, finding the next step and completing it, and setting the work down and returning again. To resist the accumulation of small shortcuts, because in the construction of a scale model aircraft, the small shortcuts accumulate into large failures. The slightly misaligned rib that becomes a warped wing, the slightly under-tightened screw that becomes a lost control surface at altitude. The discipline of the build was not a separate thing from the pleasure of the build. It was the same thing, experienced from different temporal distances. In the moment, it was discipline. Across the months, it was pleasure. The forces that changed Top Flite's world did not arrive dramatically. They arrived in the way that most significant changes arrive, gradually at first, and then with an acceleration that made the gradual seem, in retrospect, like a warning that had not been heeded. The ARF revolution, almost ready to fly, began in earnest in the late 1980s and transformed the market through the 1990s. The concept was straightforward. Instead of selling a builder the raw materials to construct an aircraft over several months, sell them an aircraft that had been constructed in a factory, covered, hinged, and finished, requiring only the installation of radio and engine equipment and a few hours of final preparation before it was ready to fly. The ARF addressed a real problem. A significant and growing portion of the potential RC flying audience wanted to fly but not to build, and the traditional kit had no answer to that preference except to say that the building was worth doing, which was true but not commercially responsive. Top Flite produced ARF versions of their warbird designs. The giant P-47 ARF, with its built-up balsa construction and factory-applied MonoKote trim, could be assembled in 15 to 20 hours rather than the 3 or 4 months that the kit version required. The scale details, the painted fiberglass cowl, the molded panel lines, the retractable landing gear were present in the ARF as they had been in the kit. The aircraft in the air was nearly indistinguishable from its kit-built predecessor. The difference was not in the aircraft, it was in the builder. The person who had assembled the ARF did not know the aircraft in the way that the kit builder knew it. They had not put each rib in place and watched the wing take shape across a dozen evenings. They had not wrestled with the fiberglass work, or learned by experience the correct consistency of the epoxy, or the correct technique for sheeting a wing with compound curves. They knew how to install a servo and connect a pushrod. They did not know the aircraft. This distinction mattered to the community that Top Flite had built its reputation on. It mattered at the scale contests, where a kit-built model and an ARF were visually similar in the air, but where the pilot who had built the kit had developed a relationship with the aircraft's specific behavior and characteristics that the ARF pilot had not had the opportunity to develop through construction. It mattered at the flying field, where the kit builder's crash had a different emotional weight than the ARF pilot's crash, because the kit builder's crash represented the loss of months of work as well as the loss of an aircraft. These distinctions were invisible to the newcomer and obvious to the experienced builder, and their obviousness to the experienced builder was, paradoxically, one of the things that made the experienced builder resistant to the ARF concept, even as the market moved toward it. The foam revolution followed. In the 2000s, the development of high-density foam as a structural material for model aircraft, foam that could be precisely cut to airfoil profiles, that accepted surface details pressed into it during manufacturing, that could be covered with a factory-applied film or painted directly, and that was light enough and strong enough for sport flying, changed the economics of the model aircraft market in ways that balsa construction could not directly compete with. A foam P-51 could be produced at a cost dramatically lower than a balsa P-51. And while the structural character of the two materials was completely different, the foam aircraft surface smooth and homogeneous, where the balsa aircraft surface revealed the skeleton beneath it. The foam aircraft flew, and it flew at a fraction of the cost of the balsa alternative. Hobbico, the Champaign, Illinois-based conglomerate that had assembled the American hobby industry's major brands through acquisitions during the 1980s and 1990s, had become the corporate parent of Top Flite, along with Great Plains, Tower Hobbies, and dozens of other brand names. The vertical integration that Hobbico represented, manufacturer, distributor, and retailer in one corporate structure, had made sound business sense in the era of mail-order catalog retail and was under increasing pressure in the era of internet commerce and overseas manufacturing. The independent hobby shop that had been Top Flite's primary retail channel was contracting steadily through the 2000s. The online retailers that replaced it competed primarily on price, and price was not where Top Flite's balsa and plywood kits had their advantage. Hobbico filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in January 2018, and the restructuring that followed dispersed the company's assets, including the Top Flite brand, to new owners. Horizon Hobby, which acquired the bulk of the Hobbico RC portfolio, became the steward of the Top Flite name. The physical operations, the people who had designed the kits and written the instruction manuals and photographed the build sequences and tested the prototypes were dispersed in the way that people are dispersed when the company that employed them is restructured. The Top Flite name continues on products that exist in a changed market for changed reasons, serving a hobby community that has been transformed by 2 decades of technology shift. Some of those products are serious kits for serious builders, designed with the same commitment to scale accuracy and structural integrity that the Gold Edition name had represented. Others are different things, serving the parts of the market that have grown while the traditional kit building segment has contracted. The name is the same. The world the name inhabits is different. There is a question underneath all of this that the Top Flite story poses but does not fully answer, because it is a question not about a company, but about a capability. The capability is patience, the specific embodied, practiced patience that a long-form kit build required and developed, and that the ARF and the foam model and the plug-and-fly electric aircraft do not require and do not develop. Patience of the kind that a Top Flite Gold Edition build required is not passive. It is not waiting in a line or sitting through something unwanted. It is the active state of sustained investment in a project that will not be completed today. That requires you to resist the shortcut. That teaches you, through the specific consequence of having cut the shortcut and seen what it cost, the particular discipline of sequence. Things have to be done in a particular order. Some steps cannot be reversed. Some adhesives cannot be removed once they have set. These facts are not obstacles to the experience of building. They are the experience of building. They are what makes the experience educational in the original and most direct sense. They change what you know by changing what you have done. What we lose when patience is no longer practiced is not easy to describe because it is not a single thing. It is a disposition, a way of approaching any project that requires time, that rewards incremental daily investment, that produces its best results for the person who is willing to return to it for weeks or months without the reinforcement of visible, dramatic progress. The person who has built a Top Flite Gold Edition warbird from the flat die cut sheets to the finished flying aircraft has developed this disposition in a specific and concrete way. It lives in their hands, in their understanding of sequence and process, in their tolerance for the intermediate state in which the project is neither raw material nor finished work. It transfers. The builder who spent 4 months on a Gold Edition P51 brings something to every other long project in their life, to the kitchen renovation and the graduate thesis and the code base that will take a year to refactor, that the person who has only ever assembled something fast and finished it quickly does not have. The intermediate state is perhaps the most important thing that the building process teaches, and the hardest thing to teach any other way. Wing panel that is partially framed, 3 ribs in place, the 4th ready to be fitted, the whole assembly clearly recognizable as a wing but not yet complete. occupies a specific and instructive position between raw material and finished work. It is not the balsa sheet from which it came. It is not yet the wing it will become. It is in the process of becoming, and the person who is building it knows something that cannot be communicated by showing the finished result. What it feels like to be in the middle of something that will take more time than it has taken so far. This knowledge is not theoretical. It is the direct embodied experience of continuing when the result is not yet visible, of trusting that the daily increments are accumulating towards something worth having. Once you have this experience in one domain, you recognize it in every domain. The builder who has been through it brings something to everything they attempt afterward. If you built one of these kits, if you spread those plans across your workbench and pinned the first rib into place and watched the wing assemble itself across a dozen evenings, share that experience in the comments below. Not because the nostalgia is the point, but because the account of what that experience was and what it gave to the person who had it is worth keeping. The people who built these aircraft are the living record of a form of craftsmanship that the market no longer prioritizes, and their memories are the archive. Leave what you remember, and let someone else read it and understand what was possible when patience was something a hobby could teach. Return to the workbench. The building board is still there, the surface marked with the T-pin holes of a dozen previous projects, the edges dark with the accumulated handling of years. The plans are rolled out over it, held flat by the blocks of balsa used as weights. The wing panel is partially framed, 3 ribs in place, and pinned, the main spar sitting in its notches, waiting for the 4th rib to be fitted and the whole assembly to be glued and left to cure. The balsa dust is on every surface. The bottle of thin CA is on the right side of the board. The sanding block is on the left. The instruction manual is open to the page you were on when you stopped last night, because you always stop at the end of a step, not in the middle of one. This aircraft, whatever aircraft this particular build was, whatever warbird has been committed to these particular evenings, will take months. You know this. You knew it when you opened the box and spread the part sheets and counted the pieces. The knowing did not dissuade you. In its own way, part of the invitation. Top Flite made that invitation in a specific and demanding form for the better part of 4 decades. The Gold Edition designation was their word for the best they could offer. The most accurate, the most carefully designed, the most worthy of the time that a serious builder would give it. Thousands of builders accepted the invitation and completed the aircraft and flew them at AMA fields, and at scale contests, and at club days, where the aircraft drew the attention of pilots who had not yet built one but were thinking about it. The aircraft are still out there, in garages and basements, under drop cloths, waiting for someone who still has the patience to begin again. In glass display cases, in the workshops of builders who have grown too old to fly them, but not too old to remember what it meant to build them. On the shelves of collectors who found them in estate sales, incomplete or complete, and who understood what they were looking at. In the hands of the builders who never stopped, who are right now at a workbench, somewhere with a part number and a plan sheet, and enough evenings ahead of them to see the thing through. The building board knows the difference between something made quickly and something made with care. The balsa knows, the MonoKote knows, the aircraft in the air knows what was made here, at this board, in these evenings. That is not a small thing. That is not a thing that convenience can replace. That is the specific, earned, irreducible product of patience, practiced seriously over a long time in the service of something that deserved it. Top Flite knew this. The builders knew it. The aircraft flying at scale above the grass on a summer morning knew it better than either of them.